Hello, this is Eric Michael Lloyd, Master's in Psychology, Neuropsychology Concentration. Thank you for your time. The balloons in the background here, waving from side to side on the left. Um, Actually, your right would be for my birthday yesterday. My mother, grandmother, and sister uh, got balloons for me, sung happy birthday. We had a great dinner, healthy dinner, and ate cheesecake. And I almost ate the whole cake. But today I wanted to talk about a well known experiment called the Milgram experiment, a well known experiment by many psychology majors or those who even took introduction to psychology, which I would imagine would be just about everybody since it's one of the most common majors or was. Not sure if those stats are updated. This is from simplepsychology.com. The Milgram Shock Experiment by Saul MacLeod, updated 2007. One of the most famous studies of obedience in psychology was carried out by Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale University. He conducted an experiment focusing on the conflict between obedience to authority and personal conscience. Milgram, 1963, examined justifications for acts of genocide offered by those accused at the World War II Nuremberg war criminal trials. Their defense often was based on obedience, that they were just following orders from their superiors. Sorry about that. The experiments began in July 1961, a year after the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Milgram devised the experiment to answer the question, could it be that Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we call them all accomplices? Milgram, 1974. Milgram, 1963, wanted to investigate whether Germans were particularly obedient to authority figures, as this was a common explanation for the Nazi killings in World War II. Milgram selected participants for his experiment by newspaper advertising for male participants to take part in a study of learning at Yale University. The procedure was that the participant was paired with another person and drew lots to find out who would be the learner and who would be the teacher. The draw was fixed so that the participant was always the teacher. The one volunteering for the experiment was always the teacher in this experiment, apparently just realizing these were all males as well. I wonder if these same results would be found if women were included. I don't know if they probably updated the study. I have to look at that as well. The draw was fixed so that the participant was always the teacher. The learner was one of Milgram's confederates, pretending to be a real participant, meaning assistant researcher. And it shows a picture here of the voltage in this experiment. Voltage was from 15 volts to 300 volts, all the way up to 450 volts. At 300 volts, there is a sign that says danger. At 450 volts, there's a sign that says XXX, which we know means death. The learner, a Confederate called Mr. Wallace, was taken into a room and had electrodes attached to his arms, and the teacher and researcher went into a room next door that contained an electric shock generator and a row of switches marked from 15 volts, slight shock, to 375 volts, danger, severe shock, to 450 volts, XXX, meaning death. It has a video here of Milgram's experiment, which you can click on. Aim of this study: Milgram, 1963, was interested in researching how far people would go in obeying an instruction if it involved harming another person. Stanley Milgram was interested in how easily ordinary people could be influenced to committing atrocities. For example, Germans in World War II. Procedure. Volunteers were recruited for a controlled experiment investigating learning, ethics, deception, reason for a pretty good experiment for deception used in research analyses. Participants were 40 males aged between 20 and 50 whose jobs ranged from unskilled to professional from the New Haven area. They were paid $4.50 for just turning up, or for just showing up. At the beginning of the experiment, they were introduced to another participant who was a confederate of the experiment, experimenter, Milgram. Once again, this means research assistant. They drew straws to determine their roles, learner or teacher, although this was fixed and the confederate was always the learner. There was also an experimenter dressed in a gray lab coat, played by an actor, not Milgram, not Stanley Milgram, the principal investigator of the study, principal researcher. 2 rooms in the Yale Interaction Laboratory were used, one for the learner with an electric chair and another for the teacher and experimenter with an electric shock generator. The learner, Mr. Wallace, was strapped into a chair with electrodes after he has learned a list of word pairs given to him to learn. The teacher tests him by naming a word and asking the learner to recall its pair from a list of 4 possible choices. The teacher is told to administer an electric shock every time the learner makes a mistake, increasing the level of shock each time. There were 30 switches on the shock generator marked from 15 volts, slight shock, to 450, danger or severe shock. The learner gave mainly wrong answers on purpose, and for each of these, the teacher gave him an electric shock. When the teacher refused to administer a shock, the experimenter was to give a series of orders, prods, to ensure they continued. No, it's okay, just continue. There were 4 prods, and if one was not obeyed, then the experimenter, Mr. Williams, read out the next prod, and so on. Prod 1, please continue. Prod 2, the experiment requires you to continue. Prod 3, it's absolutely essential you continue. Prod 4, you have no other choice but to continue. Results: 65%, 2/3 of participants, i.e. teachers, continued to the highest level of 450 volts, which is death. All participants continued to 300 volts. All the participants continued to 300 volts. 2/3 of them continued to a lethal dose of electricity, 450 volts. Good thing this was an experiment. Milgram did more than one experiment. He carried out 18 variations of his study. All he did was alter the situation, the independent variable, the IV, to see how this affected obedience, the dependent variable. Conclusion: ordinary people are likely to follow orders given by an authority figure, even to the extent of killing an innocent human being. Obedience to authority is ingrained in all of us from the way we are brought up. People tend to obey orders from other people if they recognize their authority as morally right or legally based. This response to legitimate authority is learned in a variety of situations. For example, in the family, school, and workplace. Milgram summed up the article, "The Perils of Obedience." Milgram, 1974, writing, "The legal and philosophic aspects of obedience are of enormous import, but they say very little about how most people behave in concrete situations. I set up a simple experiment at Yale University to test how much pain an ordinary citizen would inflict on another person simply because he was ordered to by an experimental scientist. Stark authority was pitted against the subject's participants' strongest moral imperatives against hurting others, and with the subject's participants' ears ringing with the screams of the victims. Authority won more often than not. The authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any length on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study and the fact most urgently demanding explanation. So that's the end of the simplepsychology.org article. The next part is regarding Milgram's agency theory. I'll read that in the next video. Thank you for your time.